Well, we should get started. I'm sure that a few people will, as these things are, dribble in as we get started. I'm just going to press the record button from my end. Okay, I'm looking around and I think I know many of you, but for those of you who don't know, I'm Dr. Marika Casas. I'm the head of Classics and Religion. So we're just going to start with the land acknowledgement. All right, so welcome to the University of Calgary and to the Department of Classics and Religion. I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The City of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. So just a couple of quick housekeeping things, just to make sure everybody's aware that we are recording. And at the end of the lecture, Dr. Ruparel will be monitoring the chat and questions. So we would ask people to either make sure that you use the reaction button to raise your hand, because then everybody can see you, or to put your questions in chat. That will just make it easier for Dr. Ruparel. So I'm going to actually hand this over to Dr. Ruparel to introduce our wonderful speaker, Dr. Clooney. Dr. Ruparel is an associate professor in the department who specializes in comparative philosophy, hermeneutics, and pluralism. And so without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Tinu, to introduce.
Thanks very much, Marika, and thank you all for coming today. It's a really great pleasure for me to introduce our 2020 Craigie lecturer, Professor Francis Clooney. Some of you may have heard some of this from yesterday at the great talk he gave yesterday through the public lecture at the library. After a PhD from the University of Chicago, Dr. Clooney taught at Boston College for 21 years before becoming a Parkman Professor of Divinity and Professor of Comparative Theology at Harvard Divinity School in 2005. Over his illustrious career, he has been a visiting professor at the universities of Oxford, Berkeley, Chicago, Princeton, and John Carroll University. And it's our privilege today to hear him as our Peter Craigie Memorial Lecturer. I've known Professor Clooney's work for almost 30 years now, but only recently looked at his CV, and I have to tell you, it was quite something. He has written or edited 21 books, over 240 or peer-reviewed articles, with 18 more in press or forthcoming, over 170 review articles, as well as blogs that he's written for 8 years for the Jesuit Review, as well as his own blog. So just to give you an idea, that's an average of a book every 2 years, 7 articles per year, and 5 reviews per year, in addition to teaching and everything else. Add to this his 4 honorary doctorates, honorary fellowships, and lifetime achievement awards from the British Academy and the Catholic Theological Society of America, as well as leadership and board positions in the American Academy of Religion and a host of top-flight journals and societies. Additionally, as I say, he still teaches courses 2 and 2, and supervises graduate students, and serves as a priest in his parish. So I'm sure you will agree with me that this is a truly remarkable career. And I really wonder if Frank sleeps ever. With all that work, I'm kind of amazed that he's upright and conscious and with us here today. Perhaps, Frank, you really should take a nap occasionally. Despite his prolific output and leadership in the areas of Indology, Christian theology, Hindu-Christian, and interreligious dialogue, and being one of the founding figures in the burgeoning field of comparative theology, I can tell you from personal history that Frank is one of the most down-to-earth, caring, and gracious scholars I've had the pleasure to know. I doubt he'll remember this, but I first met Frank at the American Academy of Religion in New Orleans in 1996, where after a meeting of the Society of the Hindu-Christian Studies Society, Frank invited me along to lunch with him and our own Harold Coward, one of our colleagues. I was just about finished my PhD then, and I was really somewhat overawed by Frank's interest in my research, which was itself very influenced by his book, Theology After Vedanta. I remember this event as feeling like a kind of initiation into the Fellowship of Scholars, and I was particularly gratified to meet the author of what has since become a maxim for comparative theology: to humbly follow truth wherever we find it. As Marika said, there's a bit of housekeeping, so please do put your questions in, or let me know if you've got a question. I'll certainly try to get you there. And Frank is going to talk about 45 minutes, and then we'll have a good long time after that, another 45 for questions and discussions and things like that. So please welcome with me Professor Francis Clooney, who will speak on the topic of comparative theology, faith-seeking understanding across religious borders. So over to you, Frank.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Tinu, for both, I don't know, counting things in my CV, and also, more importantly, for your memory of that lunch with Harold Coward. I knew of Calgary, of course, first from hearing and then meeting Harold way back. And I've always had a good feel for Calgary and the campus and the people I meet there. And knowing Tinu has been here all these years has been a wonderful thing as well. I did visit once. I think this may have come up yesterday. We were trying to think of maybe 15 years ago. Morny Joy was running a project like in comparative philosophy of religion, and was kind enough to invite me. And I was always looking forward to coming back. And so maybe some other time I will be able to come back and be with you. But I'd like to thank again the department for this invitation to be the Craigie lecturer. Marika has been very kind and gracious, and Carolyn very kind and gracious, and Tinu also, and all of you for coming today. Courtney in the background, making sure things went well, has always been wonderful too. So I think what I will try to do is kind of sketch out a whole range of issues related to comparative theology, at the risk of telling some of you more than you need to know, and maybe some of you less than you do know, because this may not be a field you're familiar with or run into before. And therefore, I will really look forward to the questions when we can, tease it out in all different directions to make this a more useful session for all of us. The first thing I'd say is that comparative theology, as I talk about it, is in fact, it's a kind of theology. It's a kind of comparative work, and it's deeply involved because it's particular and focused. It's deeply involved in area studies or the study of particular religious traditions. And I would say that all three of those are essential to what I mean by comparative theology. Theological in some loose sense, echoing St. Augustine and St. Anselm in the Christian tradition, faith-seeking understanding. That kind of maxim that I think is extremely helpful. There is faith, but it's still in the process of seeking. It's not faith that has all the answers. And it's looking for some kind of intellectual input and content that can change the way the faith is apprehended. So this kind of dynamic of theology. It's obviously comparative or interreligious. We can talk about this later. Using the term comparative may conjure up all kinds of good and bad memories about how people do comparative work or what comparison stands for. But I've certainly meant it by it over the decades, the back and forth across religious borders or boundaries among religious traditions. So one can see analogs even, let's say, within Christian ecumenism, or within several schools of Hinduism, or within various forms of Islam. One could have intra-comparative theology, but I think of it more in terms of the broader kind of comparison. And because of what I just said, in the particular, it, for me, has ideally involved some kind of deep-rooted commitment to learning from another religious tradition in a way that is kind of recognizable both to members of that other tradition and also to scholars who focus primarily on that tradition. And so I've tried over the years in my work, for better or worse, I guess all of our work is for better or worse, to be able to do my Sanskrit, to do my Tamil study, to talk about India with a certain competence regarding the text and the history of the materials I work with, in a way that Hindus, whether they Hindu intellectuals, whether they approve of it all or not, at least recognize that here's somebody who's seriously engaging our traditions, but also that Indologists, scholars of South Asia, can recognize that I'm not totally botching it or totally fabricating my information, but there's something there. And this, for me, it goes back to the fact that I did my degree at the University of Chicago, not in the divinity school, but in the South Asia department. And really wanted to have the grounding and the roots and the ability to read the languages and so on. Depending on your interest, we can talk more about that end of the spectrum later, but I won't hearken a lot to that in what follows in terms of the area studies component, although I think it's very important. So faith-seeking understanding, interreligiously in the particular, theological, comparative or interreligious, all of that I think is in play. In terms of where it comes from, I mean, the first level of where it comes from is what a lot of what I talked about yesterday, if you were able to be there, in terms of my personal experience, growing up in one tradition, having commitments in the Roman Catholic tradition, and spending a lot of time in Nepal and India over the past nearly 50 years now, without one erasing or obliterating the other. And the sense that both matter to me, they are different, they are harmonious, I find, and the back and forth between the two has to be some kind of a comparative process of crossing over and coming back, partly because that's my disposition, but I think there's something about the Catholic and something about the Hindu, one can generalize in that way, where the particularity, the visibility, the materiality, all of these things kind of have a certain power to them that you lose, and you lose a lot of what these traditions are about if you turn to abstractions or turn them into theoretical placeholders of some sort. So for me, it's personal. And I've often admitted to people over the years, and people have told me, well, so much of my work is sort of colored by the fact that it is Catholic Hindu. And as I alluded to yesterday, if somebody is working on Christian engagement with Islam, let's say, it has such a different history and such a different starting point and certain things in common that it may not work in the same way, the same dynamics of comparative theology, because Islam and Christianity relate in a different way. Or certainly Christianity and Judaism, without the Judaism, there is no Christianity, and therefore there's a whole different kind of dynamic there. And also, contested sources, both for Jews, Christians, and Muslims, competing claims on the same tradition and so on. Although for 500 years, in terms of the Western Christian traditions, and much, much longer in terms of the churches of the East, the Syriac Church, and so on, there's been a Hindu-Christian interaction. It doesn't have the same specificity or the same kind of rootedness that I think one sees in Jewish, Christian, Muslim. And likewise, if one went the other way and said, well, how about Chinese traditions, or how about African traditions or Native American traditions, they're going to be different. And I never mean that one size fits all. And therefore that as I do my work and understand its comparative angle, which is so nicely suited to my work in Hindu Christian, therefore every other kind of comparative set of works should be the same. I don't believe in that, but I do think there are resemblances and elements that we can keep in mind. In terms of background, there are very good books, a ton of good books, I think, filling out this field, comparative theology, in recent years. Oliver Freiberger has a fine book, Considering Comparison, a Method for Religious Studies, in which he, though admittedly and confessionally not a theologian, he and I have had many friendly conversations. We've been on AAR panels together and so on. And in terms of somebody thinking out of his own work in the Christian and Buddhist traditions on asceticism, for instance, but thinking about how to do comparative work, always generously finding room for my work in his models. And I think the first of the essays that I recommended to you, in fact, was from an issue of the journal Religions that Oliver edited. My essay, Reading Religiously Across Borders, a Method for Comparative Study, was sort of saying, well, I do my things in my way and I have a certain kind of intuitive approach that I'll come back to in a moment. But Oliver, in his larger model of comparison, sees room for theological work and comparative work such as I do. The other recent book that's very good in this regard is Catherine Corneille, for a long time chair of the theology department at Boston College, herself a scholar of method and comparison, but meaning and method in comparative theology. Came out a couple of years ago, in which she surveys all the way people have talked about comparative theology in recent decades, my work, but many other scholars as well. And it's a fine kind of starting point for thinking about comparative theology, particularly in the Roman Catholic view of things. And she's in that tradition herself. So those are books in the background: Freiberger, Cornel's book, my book, Comparative Theology, a 2010 book, Deep Learning Across Religious Borders. I was asked to write that book by Wiley Blackwell, an editor there. She took me to lunch at Oxford, and she was very charming. And she said, what I want you to do is write a book sort of like Bertrand Russell's Introduction to Philosophy. And while I was not thinking I would ever write a book about comparative theology, I was intrigued by the idea that I could do something like Bertrand Russell. And I said, I'll take this task on. I don't know if I succeeded, probably not, but nonetheless, that book was kind of my statement in 2010 of where I see the field. And then you do, I think you may have had access to, but I'll talk a little bit about it later, Traveling the Via Pulchritudinis, the Way of Beauty, as a two-way street, going both ways on that, as an example of my comparative theological work. So those are resources that we can talk about, and I can tell you more about any of that as we go along. When I started talking about comparative theology, and it was sort of in the late 70s, early 80s, and then more explicitly and consciously when I was a young professor at Boston College. I got there in 1984, and as Tinu said, was there for 21 years on the faculty, a very wonderful university. I thought I was sort of inventing the term comparative theology at first, because there were older faculty in the department who were not, I would say, hostile, but they were certainly condescending. And they said, well, you have a degree from the University of Chicago in Hinduism, world religions. That's something for the undergrads. We have a doctoral program in theology, but the world religions have nothing much to do with theology. At best, you would be a comparative religion person. And they didn't mean that necessarily in a kind sense, but they were rather, again, they were not comfortable with other religions showing up in the department at BC. This was older faculty. The majority of the faculty, were on board and very supportive, but older faculty in those days. So I pushed back by saying, I'm a theologian just like you are. I do Catholic theology, faith-seeking understanding, just as you do. It's just that instead of reading the Greeks and the Germans, I read Sanskrit texts, I read Tamil texts, and so on. And I pushed back and began to use this term comparative theology more frequently. But I learned over the years, I think first clued in by Robert Neville, a good friend at Boston University, he's now retired from BU, who pointed out to me that there was a 19th century school of comparative theology at BU. John McCullough was a famous figure who wrote a book called Comparative Theology. Clark, and other figures who tried in the 19th century, as McCulloch did, to kind of look at all the religions of the world and generously thinking, include the Shinto, include Taoism, include Confucianism, try to have a set of 8 or 10 or 12 religions, use that term loosely, and look at them all together and make comparisons of their theology, their ethics, their ways of life, their views of the afterlife. And a number of these scholars were using the term comparative theology. Max Muller at Oxford sometimes used comparative religion, used comparative theology as well. And that was a well-established school that sort of died out, I think, at BU. But Neville himself was quite happy to talk of his work as comparative philosophy, comparative theology, comparative religious ideas was a project he sponsored for a few years in the late 90s at BU. But I began to realize that there was an older tradition that I was inadvertently becoming part of. The oldest book that I found in this regard was puzzle. It's always been a puzzle for me. It's sort of out there on its own. 1699, a book in Latin called Theologia Comparativa, which in 1700 came out in English as Comparative Theology by an Englishman named James Garden. And apparently he was a kind of on the border of kind of a mystical thinker and involved with French mystics, Madame Guénon and so on like that. there was a whole kind of looking for a kind of esoteric Christianity. But in this book that he called Comparative Theology, the motivation was we are fighting endlessly about religion, and he meant Protestants in the UK. We're fighting constantly about religion because we're always kind of trying to be absolute theologians, where I'm absolutely true and you're absolutely wrong. And we're stressing what divides us. And he said, what we need to do is look for the common ground among ourselves, and we need to do comparative theology. And it's like a 80-page little book. Why it was first in Latin, I was never clear. And did he invent the term in 1699? I haven't been clear on that. If anyone wants the book, I have a PDF of it. I can send it to you if you'd like to read this little book. But what I think there, and I've never connected what he did to what Max Muller did or McCulloch did or Clark did and others in the 19th century, that they were reading him and saying, let's do it interreligiously instead of just ecumenically. But there may be some connection because so many people who've become involved in interreligious learning talk about, instead of focusing on what divides us, we should focus on what brings us together. And Garden was sort of a prophet of that, using the term. Of course, if you start, not worrying about the term comparative theology, you can go back to the earliest church in the West, certainly, in terms of the engagement with the Greek world, the Roman world, learning from the Greek classics and so on like that. All of these things, you can go back to the Hebrew Bible and ancient Near Eastern, learning from the cultures around Israel, how that affected the way the Jewish people thought about their faith and so on. But in terms of the modern usage of the term, Garden is the first one I found who seemed to be using the term. It came up more in the mid-20th century, and I've not done a thorough history of it. For the Encyclopedia of Religion, edited by Mircea Eliade, David Tracy of the University of Chicago did an essay on comparative theology, in which he talks about it in terms of like as a historical inquiry, comparing theologies and seeing how people have developed their religious ideas, understanding theology better by seeing how people have done their theological thinking. And so you can take concepts or methods from Christian theology of different denominations, or Christian and Hindu and Buddhist and so on like that, and compare the concepts, and you clarify things. I always thought that it didn't go far enough because there's a certain kind of personal engagement, a personal crossing over, a kind of constructive angle that Tracy doesn't highlight in his essay, but he made it more well known in the context of that great encyclopedia from the 80s. As I mentioned, Robert Neville became a proponent of the term with his Comparative Religious Ideas project at BU in the late 90s. Volumes came out of that, The Human Condition, Ultimate Realities, Religious Truth. And I was happy to be a participant in those volumes. Keith Ward at Oxford, even before that, had a series of books on revelation, creation, the social condition, I think about 4 or 5 volumes eventually, where Keith Ward, being a very creative, engaging theologian who has worked on many different topics over the years. I know him when he was at Oxford as the Regius Professor of Divinity. But he said, let's take themes in Christian theology, like revelation, and then I, who am not an expert in any of the other religions, he admitted, let's see what they have to say about the same topics, and then reflect on that from a Christian perspective. So he did his homework. He would talk to scholars at Oxford and elsewhere, Jewish views of revelation, Muslim views, Hindu views, Buddhist views, and so on, and then wrote these volumes in a very accessible fashion, and I thought admirable for a theologian who had no compulsion to do interreligious work. There was nothing at stake personally for him, nonetheless, to do this project. And he also, I think, helped move the field forward. I'll refer to, but I won't go deep into it now. I'm sort of the generation, younger than Ward, younger than Neville, younger than Tracy, but there are an awful lot of theologians younger than me by now. And there are all kinds of people claiming and using the term comparative theology, both in continuity with the way people like myself or James Fredericks or others of my generation would do comparative work, but younger people doing it in terms of new and emerging needs. And this came up a little bit yesterday about ethnographic work, lived religion, materiality, theologies of the body, gender differentiated work and the like in theology, much more conscious of elements of power, domination, exclusion, and so on. There's a whole kind of new emerging fields of comparative theology that I highly commend and try whenever possible to support people doing it, even if in many ways it's different from my own work. But nonetheless, it's a continuing tradition. I think for me, another point I'd make, I'm just rambling through a number of points which I hope are helpful, that partly for me early on in my debates at BC and at the Catholic Theological Society and so on, even the AAR, comparative theology is partly defined by what it is not. And although I have great regard for colleagues who are in the field of comparative religion or the history of religions, I think it's not comparative religion. It's not a sub-branch. It's not a subdivision of comparative religion. Because I think it's not a necessary feature of comparative religion to have the element of faith-seeking understanding. And there can be, the person doing comparative religion can be an intense believer in their tradition. That's not an issue. But it may not ever be explicit in the work they do. They don't need to talk about it. It doesn't need to come to the fore. And therefore it's not operative. And the language of crossing over and coming home, how this affects one's own tradition and so on, may never be an issue. They're doing wonderful comparative work. One of my close colleagues here at Harvard, Kimberly Patton, who certainly has strong faith, commitments in her own tradition, as a comparative religion scholar, sort of in the tradition of Wilfred Cantwell Smith, Jonathan Z. Smith. Her comparative work is brilliant and comparative and wide-ranging, but it's not explicitly theological. She could if she wanted, but she chooses to do comparative religion, and she does it wonderfully. So I think there's a difference here, and it has to do partly with where does theology fit into the academy? How does theology fit in? The AAR today is a fairly friendly environment for everything. You can always find a place to be at the AAR. But in the past, there have been kind of hardcore religion scholars who say theology is meant for the church and not for the academy, and sort of intolerant of it. But I think maybe that's not as large an issue right now. But nonetheless, comparative religion and comparative theology are different. I had a particular battles over the year with theology of religions. And this, my friend, I highly admire, Paul Knitter, in the Catholic context, and he worked for a number of years closely with John Hick, Alan Race in the UK, that theology of religions is the kind of dispositions and starting points and resources and foundations in your tradition for making sense of what the other traditions mean. So in the Catholic context, standard questions like, is there salvation outside the church? Can non-Christians be saved? And the Catholic answer for the last 60 or 70 years has been yes, of course. But nonetheless, can they be saved only through Christ or through their own faith traditions? And Alan Race had developed the very familiar categories of exclusivism, inclusivism, pluralism for different kind of positions, a spectrum of positions that Paul Knitter developed in his book, Introducing Theology as a Religion, some 20 plus years ago now. And I have no real objection to that work, but it struck me as a young scholar that most of the work that was being done at a theoretical level in which the particularities of other religious traditions didn't really matter. So to talk about whether a Hindu can be saved or not, or what is it about the saving message of Christ that allows Hindus to be saved, or Muslims to be saved, or Taoists to be saved, didn't in any way really depend on knowing much about Hindus or Buddhists or Taoists. It was more abstract about, we have to know our own tradition in very great depth and particularity in order to say something about the other traditions. But we don't actually have to know those traditions, and certainly not learn the languages and so on. And it struck me that there are too many people were theorizing about the religions of the world without actually studying the religions of the world. Now, people like Paul Knitter have over the decades, done much more than they were doing when I first encountered their work. So Paul Knitter has a kind of double engagement now as a Catholic Christian and as a Buddhist. He does Buddhist meditation. His wife is a Buddhist. And he wrote a book called, I think it's called How taking refuge with the Buddha enabled me to be a better Catholic. It's not the exact title, but something like that. So people change over time. But I was annoyed at the abstraction of the field and said, some of us should know something about the traditions that we're judging. And I tried to bring that in to the discussions. I'll come back to the point later that some people say you can't do comparative theology without having a theology of religions anyway. Are you hiding it or not? And the final distinction would be interreligious dialogue. And there's a friendly relationship, and I'm not unwilling to see comparative theology as somehow with the wider scope of interreligious dialogue, because there are all kinds of ways you can dialogue with people of other faiths. One way is the scholarly, intellectual way of studying the traditions back and forth. But when I think of what I do, it's quite different from having an ecumenical meeting or an interreligious meeting where people sit around the table. I'll talk about my tradition, you talk about your tradition, and we learn back and forth. Mine is the dialogue ends up being in your head. You are doing the dialogue in yourself, and you may correct it and have friends of the other traditions, but it's a branch or a subdivision of interreligious dialogue. It's not the same thing. And sometimes I meet people in interreligious dialogue circles who see their work as comparative theology, and I think it's not always the case, that it's not, it doesn't have the kind of academic or professional focus that theology has, much less comparative theology, even though, again, there's a friendly relationship there. A few more points, and then I'll take a breath. In the essay that I wrote for the Oliver Freiberger, the issue of the journal Religions, I identified different ways in which I do comparative work. And I think because even one person doesn't always do their work all in the same way. And I'll leave out of it, sometimes I've been asked and have done simply indological work, publish an article in something in Vedanta or the ritual thinking of Purva Mimamsa for a journal or a book or something like that, and sort of in the real specialist field. But when it comes to comparative theology, in the Oliver Freiberger edited issue, I saw my work as kind of in three forms. One is thematic comparison, starting with a point of a theme. And for the example of that, I would use the book I did in 2001, Hindu God, Christian God. And that book, deliberately trying to engage systematic theologians, was arranged around four themes: the existence of God, the name or identity of God, incarnation, and revelation. So I structured the book in terms of four themes and said, we can take up these themes in a comparative theological fashion. And I deliberately used kind of a heavy-duty Christian theologian in each case to introduce the theme. So Richard Swinburne of Oxford, who's written so much on the existence of God, but not a comparativist, on how Christians have talked about the existence of God in the 20th century and arguments for the existence of God and so on. Hans Urs von Balthasar, another heavyweight theologian in the Catholic tradition, by no means a comparativist, but on what it means to know God truly and know God's name. And for him, it's Jesus Christ, Son of the Father, very strongly Christian Catholic. What does it mean to name God and be encountered by God? On incarnation, Karl Rahner, the Jesuit theologian, the German Jesuit theologian, on his understanding of what it means for God to be human. What does that tell us not only about God, but what the human is, opening into the infinite? And basically the point with these figures was that they're unexceptionably heavy-duty Christian theologians, and largely of a more conservative, slightly either a lot right of center or somewhat right of center bent, to not give the impression that comparative work is only done by liberals. I wanted to make that point. And the fourth one was Karl Barth on Revelation. And so bringing up these four themes, and then in each case introducing from the Nyaya logical tradition of Hinduism, from Vedanta, from Shaivism, from Vaishnavism, other branches of Hindu intellectual tradition, trying to show that in some ways what Swinburne and Balthasar and Rahner and Barth were interested in, and the Christian traditions before them, were also being taken up by these Hindu intellectuals. And you don't have to be interested in interreligious dialogue. You don't have to be interested in comparative theology as your thing, but rather say, if you're interested in these topics that I identified, then you should do comparative work. How can you be interested in the topic and say, well, that's a whole world of intellectuals that I will ignore because they're not among us? Whereas it seemed that many of the same arguments are being made, and therefore one listens to them. So that was an example of starting with a theme. The second one, which is kind of vague, and I'll only mention it, is what I call difficult comparisons. Because often I think in comparative work, we bend over backwards to try to find common ground. And we try to find something parallel in terms of a deity or in terms of a theme like grace or existence of God and so on, or worship. We try to find something in common. Or analogies like between Brahman as absolute reality and God in Christian tradition. But from my work on Purva Mimamsa, which is the Hindu tradition of ritual interpretation and exegesis, which is really unlike almost anything in Christian tradition. The closest analogs might be something like in scholars of canon law or something like that. And I think there are real parallels in rabbinic Jewish tradition, but I don't have any expertise there. I'm trying to show that there's a certain sense of, there are areas of intellectual, intelligent, rational, clear thinking discourse on sacred text and all that, that are simply so different from us, they push you to the boundary of not being able to compare. Not because of apophatic realities or the ineffable or esotericism, but simply because they're so different, we don't have a place for what they do in what we do. And they either push us to open up a whole new branch of theology to do something like they do, or we realize that we don't have a complete theological repertoire. We do certain things and other things we don't do. And not to be afraid of that possibility, to see the differences there. And I wrote an essay, I edited a book with Klaus von Stosch, a wonderful comparativist at University of Paderborn in Germany, who has a wonderful program there on Islam and Catholic theology, with both Muslims and Catholics teaching in the faculty. We did a book called How to Do Comparative Theology that Fordham University Press edited. And I think I was in a bad mood when I was editing the volume. So I deliberately did the most arcane, dry, boring thing that I could possibly think of, was translate a chapter of the Purva Mimamsa Sutras, about 30 short verses from this 2,700 sutra text, verse text, a chapter about Vedic remnants. When you're doing a sacrifice, what do you do with the leftovers? And it's intensely considered, and there are cases and there are arguments. And I wanted to show that it's rational, it's accessible. You can read this, you can learn this if you try. There are 10 commentaries you can look at and so on. And you have no idea why they are interested in this topic, why they're not talking about the transcendental or about God or about grace or something. They're talking about the butter left in the spoon, or the firewood left over, or things, utensils that have been used and can't be used again. What do you do with these things? But it's part of the entire kind of integrity of the ritual, that every part fits in and everything has a place. And in a ritual, there are also rules to govern the right ordering of things that are no longer useful. And I tried to push it in terms of, we can learn even from the cases where there's something so different from what we do, we can't find a place for it in our system. And I've had people complain to me about the essay saying they didn't get the point of it, but that was sort of the point of it, that you not get the point of it, I guess. But that was the extreme. But most of my work, I think in recent years in particular, is the third form. So this thematic comparisons with a real sense of difference. And then the third type might be what I call the performative or transformative purpose. That by the comparative work, you engage the other, you learn deeply from the other, you let go of things that you thought were true, you intensify and you transform by what you learn. And that, just as one could say by reading the Bible, or reading in the Christian mystical tradition, or reading poetry of Christian mystics, one can be transformed. One can do that interreligiously as well. And that there's a kind of intensification. It doesn't mean you add new things onto your faith or change the doctrines, but you intensely experience things in a different way. So I talked a little bit yesterday about the book called Divine Mother, Blessed Mother, Hindu Goddesses and the Virgin Mary, which was the book I did after Hindu God, Christian God. And it was a quite different book because I chose for the text in the book not conceptual categories about gender or whatever, but rather these long hymns that were in praise of the goddesses, in which the more you learn them, the more you find yourself in the position of actually engaging the goddesses or talking to the goddesses. And then what do you do with that creates like high stake issues for you if you're a theologian about am I participating or just observing? Am I part of this or just looking at it from the outside? Trying to deal with that and talk about how that transforms how we look at our own faith. And in that book, Thinking of the Virgin Mary and Catholic Tradition, I did a follow-up book in 2008 called Beyond Compare, Radical Surrender to God according to the Hindu theologian Vedanta Deshika and the Catholic theologian Francis de Sales. And the whole idea that the point of study and the point of the religious life is to go through different kinds of love. And the deeper you go in love, the more you enter into this pure love of surrender to God. And in that pure love of surrender to God, you let go of much of what you thought would protect you and keep you independent. And I argued that doing it twice over, doing it in two traditions, takes away another layer of protection because you think the beautiful idea of surrendering to God is only basically in my own tradition. Well, guess what? It's not. And guess what? You can learn some of this by another tradition as well. And therefore, the intensity of learning to let go and to surrender to God twice over in two traditions is a great act of intensification. And I use treatises, Vedanta Deshika, a great 13th century Hindu theologian, his treatise called The Essence of the Three Mysteries, Rahasya Traya Sara, all about surrender to God. And then Francis de Sales, his treatise on the love of God, a beautiful text in French, the back and forth between the two. And then I'll just give you one more example of that. I did in 2013 a book called His Hiding Place is Darkness. And this was kind of the follow-up of seeing the intensity of the realization of God that is gained when God is absent. So not the apophatic or not the mystery of the Godhead or something like that, but you have intense experiences of God and then God is gone or missing, the longing for God. And I use text and commentary of the Song of Songs in the Bible, using the medieval commentaries of Bernard of Clairvaux, Gilbert of Hoyland, John of Ford, in that Cistercian tradition of commentary. I could have done the Jewish tradition. I couldn't have done I could see doing the Jewish tradition, but since I don't know Hebrew, that was really a limitation there. But nonetheless, this sense of the coming and going of the beloved, and the young woman looking in the night for the beloved and all that as another level of kind of spiritual engagement, read with the poetry of the Alvar, Nam Alvar, 9th century or so Tamil saint. Many of his songs in his 1,000-verse work, The Holy Word of Mouth, Tiruvaimori, are about the young woman yearning for the lover who is absent. And the medieval commentaries expand this at great length and kind of draw you into it, so you become part of this drama of seeking after the beloved. So there it's a kind of intensification that was at stake. So I point those three examples out, and I'm going fast, but we can talk about these things if insofar as it's of interest. Thematic comparison, difficult comparison, and this kind of transformative, intensifying comparison as ways that I do comparative theology. And there are other ways as well, philosophically more engaged and so on. But I think it has somewhat to do with the personality, the interest of the theologian, how they do their work. And this would be true in any kind of academic work anyway. We do it in part according to our personalities and our own preferences. The last thing I'll say, and there are more things I can go into, such as objections to the field and all that, and I might come back to that in a bit, is about the second essay that I gave you on the way of beauty, the Via Pulchritudinis. Was an effort that I did. It was out of a conference at Notre Dame a few years back, where following up on some of the post-Vatican II language about the transcendentals, so the way of truth, the way of goodness, and the way of beauty, is that much of Christian discourse with other religions has been through truth, doctrine, argument, apologetics, or rational, philosophical theology. And then much has been done in terms of moral issues, in terms of which religion does more for the sake of people, which makes us more human, which is more in solidarity with excluded people, and so on like that. And the feel under actually a number of popes, Paul VI, then John Paul II, and then even Pope Benedict, the idea that the path of beauty opens up another whole aesthetic frame in which one can present the Christian faith in a way that is accessible to people from outside the faith who might not be attracted by the rationality of doctrine or by the moral principles of Christianity. The beauty of the faith, the music, the art, the liturgy, the scriptures, and so on, that would draw people in. And we were kind of asked to think about the via pulchritudinis, the way of beauty, as a way of engaging people in other religions. Well, being the kind of person I am, I said, well, it has to be a two-way street. It's not simply that we will engage them and they will be attracted to the beauty of the Catholic faith and come in. But couldn't it also work the other way, that where there may be rational or moral roadblocks or limitations in terms of engaging the other, we could learn from the other deeply because of the beauty. And I've been to many, many Hindu temples and many Hindu rituals and heard many Hindu bhajans and so on, which I always find quite beautiful and tug at my heartstrings and so on, and quite beautiful. But I deliberately used a text that I had used in the Divine Mother, Blessed Mother book, appropriately called the Ocean of Beauty, a medieval text, 100 verses honoring the great goddess, Mahadevi. And the whole point of it is, in the first part, kind of a theology of the goddess and the entire universe in the goddess. And then the second part, about 55 verses or so, or 50 verses, a meditation on the goddess from the crown on her head to her feet, meditating on the beauty of her form, verse by verse, with all kinds of complications and nuances and so on, like 8 or 10 verses about her eyes, the jewelry around her neck and so on like that. But basically contemplating her beauty and being drawn into meeting her through the meditation on beauty, ending up at her feet because that's where the devotee should be. You find yourself, having done this meditation on the goddess, you reach this position of humility. And the last few verses of the Soundarya Lahari, the Ocean of Beauty, you then kind of enter into her chamber where she and Shiva sit, the god Shiva, surrounded by goddesses. And I think it's meant to be a text in Hindu tradition to kind of pull you in by the way of beauty. And my question that I raised in the paper and in the chapter was, couldn't this also work interreligiously? If we say there is a way of beauty, is it only a one-way street that the Christian tradition is beautiful and draws people in? Couldn't it go the other way? And that ways that might have, again, roadblocks, moral or intellectual, that the beauty of the other tradition pulls us in and we're there before we can really rationally explain it. And I meant to be provocative by the article, but even at Notre Dame, nobody seemed to be very annoyed by it. I don't know if they, either they liked it or didn't understand it or weren't paying attention or whatever, but it was sort of, verging on the element of loving the goddess or meeting the goddess. And I thought they might object, but nobody seemed to really object. But it was another kind of provocation in comparative theology as I've done it over the years. So I've spoken a good bit and I promised to stop, and there are more things I could say, but I'll stop there for now and discuss. And I'd be delighted to use the rest of our time simply to talk back and forth. But if there are, gaps, I can always add a few other things. But thank you for listening thus far.
Thanks so much, Frank. That was fantastic. There's just so much there to delve into. What I'll remind people to do again is perhaps to use your reactions button at the bottom to raise your hand if that's not working, because I've got a couple of screens to look for your hand there. If you just want to put your name down in the chat, if you want to either put your question down in the chat or just put your name down, that way I can make sure that I can get to your question. And if you'd like to speak and converse, that would be fine as well. Just remember to unmute and then mute yourself back again. So while you're started, perhaps thinking of your questions and where you want to go, perhaps I'll start us off. You used a couple of times, you used this metaphor for comparative theology, and perhaps this was one of the sort of, identifying marks of comparative theology versus comparative religion. This metaphor of being home and then going away and perhaps coming home again, that notion of being part of a tradition and then engaging and learning from others, and then coming back. And I wondered whether, that metaphor might be perhaps artificially limiting in a certain way, simply because, these days, I think many more people are more conscious of, in some ways, not really having a home, being more peripatetic, being the conglomeration of a number of different sources. And so the idea of a home being a kind of stable identity, perhaps is not really, I mean, of course, some people will do that, but I'm wondering whether more and more people feel globalized to some extent, right? And in that sense, the notion of coming home may not actually appeal. Rather, it's a kind of constant peripatetic journey going from one point to another. And it points out the fact that actually, I think now more commonly, we are sort of more hybrid, more combinations of various, places and traditions and things like that. But the thing I want to point out about that is that actually, if you start looking into our traditions, you find hybridity all the way down. This idea of purity and home just doesn't really cash out that much, apart from quite artificial contexts. So I don't know, I wonder if you could just chat about that a bit more.
Yeah. I mean, the first thing is you're right that I tend to use that terminology a lot of crossing over and coming back. I think I imbibed it somehow from John Donne, D-U-N-N-E, a longtime theologian at University of Notre Dame, who wrote these beautiful kind of meditative books with the metaphor of crossing over and then coming back and learning from life and learning from all kinds of different ways, from art and so on, by crossing and coming back. I've never explicitly, I think, used his work, but when I think of the terminology, I often realize that perhaps I was getting it in part from him. I think several things I'd say is, one is, why do I use it though? I think in part because it's almost literally what I experienced. My naive perceptions, I mean, I grew up in New York City, so by no means a small town where everybody was alike, but New York City, Irish Catholic New York City, and then going to Nepal and coming home again. And neither staying in Nepal nor becoming a Hindu or a Buddhist, but going there, coming back, and then coming back entirely differently. It sort of spoke to me in a simple or perhaps simplistic way of coming from one place where I was pretty sure of the Catholic thing, going to the other place and then coming back again. And there may be that element too. But I think that the two kinds of critiques I've received, the second of which is the one the second question is the one you're raising. The first one is, there's a wonderful book by a younger comparativist called Teaching Comparative Theology in the Millennial Classroom. Some of you may know Reid Lachlan, who teaches at St. Michael's in Toronto, and Mara Brecht. They did this wonderful collection of essays, younger people, about teaching, and it relates to what do young people think about religion today. But one of the essays in there raises the question that it seems to reify the starting point, the other point, and then the coming back, as if there is a here, here, and a there, and you go, the dynamic is the traveling. But at the end of the day, Irish Catholic New York Catholicism is unchanged. You go to the other and then you safely come back home, which I never quite meant, I think, because I think I see the complexities of the Catholic and certainly the complexities of the Hindu. But the metaphor, I think, was always helpful to me in explaining to a range of Catholics, particularly more conservative Catholics, who were saying to me, if you study other religions, you will lose your faith and you will become one of them. And my view was no, that you go, you travel, you come back, you're on pilgrimage, you return. But then for some people, it was interpreted as saying you're playing it safe, that no matter how much you learn from the other, you can always come back home to an unchanging Catholic Church, which I didn't mean. But I think you're, Tino, raising a deeper question, which even when I was at BC and all the time at Harvard, I'm getting about, that's fine. People say to me, well, it's fine that you seem to come from somewhere. You tell your story about Brooklyn, New York, Irish Catholic, and so on. But we grew up, we're the children of the baby boomers. We're not the baby boomers, we're the children of the baby boomers. And we grew up with much more diverse. You know, my mother was a Catholic who became a Buddhist, and my father gave up on religion altogether. Or my mother's second marriage was to a Chinese person who was a Confucian. All these complications come in, and not having a stable here, and then learning in academic work, certainly at places like Harvard again, I'm sure in Calgary too, that religious traditions are complex, and constructing them and naming them is a problematic process, so that it's all very complicated. And there's probably some kind of an agenda you have in naming this and naming that. But that young people saying, well, I'm a seeker, I'm spiritual but not religious, I don't want to be a card-carrying member of the Catholic Church, and I'm not a Sri Vaishnava Hindu. So how do we work this? I think what I've had to do over the years is talk about this in a more metaphorical fashion. All right, you may not come from, all right, so you're not a Lutheran, and you're not a Tibetan Buddhist, but nonetheless, you do come from somewhere. You have your own autobiography, of your own story, your own starting points. And if you're learning interreligiously, you should be stretching and challenging where you came from, not simply selectively choosing the parts of other traditions that confirm who you already were. That it tries to open up a dynamic of saying, all right, okay, here I am, such and such an age and experience. This is where I'm starting. Where do you, 25 years old in my class, where are you starting from? And try to make it work that way. Others, yourself, Tino, and others may have other ways of dealing with that, but that's sort of a range of things I'm thinking about that.
Thanks very much. I will keep looking for your hands, but I do have a question here. Do you see a historical rhythm between movements of iconoclasm and the way of beauty? Where might different groups sit today with regards to iconoclasm?
And then I see Wendy Adamek has her hand up, so I'll answer this and then can bring her in. I mean, that's an interesting question, because most of the Hindu traditions I deal with and the Roman Catholic tradition are not iconoclastic. We indulge wildly in imagery. I think one of the reasons I love going to Hindu temples is because they're full of things to look at. They're not austere, they're not, empty spaces with a pulpit or something like that, but there's tons of statues and colors and paintings and so on. I was at another Notre Dame conference in Rome a couple of years ago, and on the last day they took us over for a private tour of St. Peter's Basilica. And the Hindus in the group loved St. Peter's. They just loved all the stuff going on in St. Peter's, all the statues, all the tombs, all the paintings, the Pietà, the fact that the Mass was going on and tourists are wandering around. They felt at home that this is a place where all your senses are alive. And I think the iconoclastic thing, that would be interesting, either in terms of an apophatic principle or a Protestant principle, at least in some loose sense of getting rid of these images that stand between us and the Word of God, stripping away sense imagery and getting back to the basics. There may be some of that, and I think for some people, I think of some of the great Western mystics in India, Swami Abhishektananda, Henri Lissot, who had an ashram in the south that B. Griffiths then took over later. But loving Advaita Vedanta, non-dualist Vedanta, where you empty your mind of everything. And I think for some people that's more comfortable because it's not in direct competition with their images of Jesus or Mary and so on. So I think there's something going on there. And then for some, it's simply an abomination to have goddesses and so on. And they would destroy it on that basis. But I remember the story of the great Hindu holy man Ramakrishna in the 19th century. He was being taught by a Hindu teacher the way of non-dualism. At least this is the way the great master talks about it. And he's trying to break through to the non-dual realization of being, consciousness, bliss. But he keeps seeing the goddess. He's a Kali worshiper, and the goddess is right there. So she says, cut the image. And he takes a sword figuratively and cuts through the goddess, and she disappears. And then he kind of falls into this ocean of bliss, which is aniconic. So it can happen even in Hindu traditions too. Does that get at what you're thinking, Tinu?
That was me that asked the question.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, okay.
I thought that was I put it on chat.
Okay. Okay. Is that okay?
I was thinking a little bit more broadly, historically. I'm thinking of the great iconoclastic movements within Orthodoxy. And also the great tradition of the Russian princes being converted to Orthodoxy because of the icons.
Yeah.
Same time, you have a movement within it rejecting it, and it comes very much up in the dialogue with Islam at various periods of time. But it seems to come and go.
Yeah, right. Judaism and Islam obviously have very different attitudes toward images. But you're right. I mean, and I've thought and encouraged people, and I don't do it, the Orthodox traditions of Christianity with the icon traditions and all that also have a home relationship with Hinduism and the images. But then how does the iconoclastic come in? Like, is Buddhism a kind of iconoclasm with respect to Hindu imagery, or non-dualist Vedanta kind of, icon destroying of get rid of the nama rupa, the name and the form, in order for something beyond it? So there's a lot of play here, but I think for me, it's been go with the images and see everything positively embodied and so on, and that works. But what you're raising is very rich area for further study, I think. I think Wendy had her hand up.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Unmute. Thank you so much. It's this is really rich and fascinating, and I want to bring up an issue about the category of experience and use Oliver Freiberger's book as a kind of way of contextualizing that, unpacking that. He's a friend, colleague. I use his book in my undergraduate religion majors class as an anchor for methodology for them to work on their own projects. And his book is a really interesting example of, it's a very Buddhist exercise, but it's been translated into a sort of generally usable in some ways methodology. And this is something that, in some ways Buddhism lends itself to. I mean, in his, as you know, because you like the book, but just for the sake of other people who may not have read it, I mean, one of the, his advocacy is for discourse comparison and awareness of situatedness of the scholar as a way of getting past the problems of decontextualizing and essentializing. So in many ways, this is similar to a Buddhist project of recognizing the lack of reality of conceptual constructs, or the provisional functional reality of conceptual constructs. So, this is, it's very interesting that this you can talk with students about how to translate this into their own projects. But there is the problem of experience. And for example, as we know, Buddhism gets pulled into all these naturalizing schemes, like because of Buddhism's anti-metaphysical commitments, it gets pulled into science. but they will, there's a firewall against the claim for direct experience of the lack of reality of conceptual constructs, which is, even the lack of reality of non-dual as a conceptual construct. And that direct experience is transformative. It's performative and transformative, and it's, there's various ways in which it's eulogized or contextualized or presented. So it's the basis of such a divide in Buddhist studies, whether or not you will accept this possibility of direct experience through all this deconstruction. So, it's a battle in Buddhist studies, and I'm definitely on the direct experience side, but you find yourself participating in conversations and in effect not outing yourself about your commitments.
Yeah, that's interesting. And for me, working with a certain strand of Hindu traditions, which are much more cataphatic and much more positive in terms of the imagery and the sense experiences. Even though I remain very interested in Shankara in terms of his Advaita Vedanta, I'm much more at home with Ramanuja's, you might say, monotheistic Vedanta, Narayana, the god, with Shri, the goddess. And there's a great confidence, I find, maybe in all these, in both Shankara and in Ramanuja, that the word is a vehicle of experience, of purifying you, of accentuating, intensifying, problematizing your life so that you're pushed to the edge of experience. But for someone like Ramanuja in the South Indian, we just celebrated his millennial birth anniversary in Tamil Nadu, a very devotional tradition of Vishnu, Rama, Krishna, the sense that everything in the world is kind of leading you into this experience of God, and that it's all, if you experience anything, you're beginning to experience God. And therefore, to leave out the experiential element or to say we cannot speak of it would be very peculiar regarding the tradition. Now, that's easy for me to say because it's also a certain form of Roman Catholicism. And, in terms of Thomism, but also the pious traditions of, modern French piety and so on like that. I mean, there's a sense of the continuity of ordinary experience and the ultimate sublime experience. And that to have a non-experiential path is either go back to somebody like Dionysius in the early church, who I'm not an expert on, but the Via Negativa, or perhaps some of the apophatic Protestant traditions about the need to not speak of what is most important, or to not give it words and images. But for me, I think it's been a matter of finding positively speaking of the experiences it makes sense. And that's what I focus on. Even though, as I said in the book I did, His Hiding Place is Darkness, a profound element of the experience of God can be the absence of the God you just experienced. And I've been doing this in class, the Rasa Leela, the dance of Krishna with the gopis, the cowherd girls in the Bhagavata Purana, where part of the intensification of their experience is Krishna is dancing with them and suddenly then Krishna's gone. And they're filled with a remembrance of what it was like when Krishna was with them. And then he comes back, and then he's gone, and then he comes back. That kind of experience, loss of experience along the way.
Yeah, if I could just follow up on that briefly, I totally agree. In this particular field, and I think Oliver's book reflects this as well, Buddhism gets pulled into these other conversations because if you're willing to present it without the experience part, it can be pulled in for methodology, it can be pulled in for naturalisms, it can be pulled into ethics, biomedical ethics. And so there's a certain appeal in the field to denying the commitment to experience or bracketing it. So you know, does that, so it sort of straddles that, what I think you're calling the theological religious studies divide. And
Yeah.
you can, yeah. So, I mean, it's
Yeah.
like, well, what, you know, what can we do about that? Because it seems a bit, it's not even artificial. It seems a bit cognitive dissonance in the field kind of
Yeah.
issue.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I mean, we could talk about it more some other time, but I think in some ways Hinduism doesn't have that kind of universal role in terms of cognitive science and brain studies and all that. And I think it's less adaptable for those kinds of purposes than at least what's perceived to be Tibetan Buddhism or Zen or something like that. And I just think that's a fact of life. And so I haven't run into that problem as much because people often think of Hinduism in a very different cultural frame, and often don't know what to do with it, because it's in your face with so many images and thousands of deities and so on. What do we do about that? But I like it. So thank you. Thank you. Megan.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, excellent, I'm here. Thank you so much, not just for the talk today, but also for the talk yesterday. I'll put my hand down. Yes, I've really enjoyed hearing you speak both yesterday and today. And I should start off my question by making a lot of caveats. I'm not a theologian. I don't even do comparative religion. I'm a social and cultural historian of Islam in South Asia. And I'm very much of, you know, like the area studies kind of school where we're very into, very, very close to Chicago's approach in many ways. I studied in Oxford's Oriental Institute, which is also very focused on languages. And so this is where I'm kind of coming from. But since coming to religious studies, I've been teaching courses on methodologies of religious studies, right? And learning about the history of the things that you mentioned that were happening in the 19th century. Max Muller's pursuit of developing something called the science of religion, which I understand to be characterized by a search for what the religious faculty of man was as something that could be universally identified, that cuts across different cultural contexts. And one of the things that the point of this comment in question really is to hear you think a little bit more aloud about this relationship between comparative theology and comparative religion, because it feels like from my admittedly uninformed view that there are both, you know, some risks and some benefits, you know, to this shift. And I'd love to hear you think more about it, because I think what I understand to be some of the worries that historians of religion have about comparative religion is that, let's think about Max Muller's approach. You know, Tomoko Masuzawa has pointed out that in the development of categories of world religions, by choosing to name and define religions in particular ways, this was done in a way that tended to reify the concept of a religious tradition that set up a hierarchy between different types of knowledge, right? And in particular, emphasizing text, you know, the way that Max Muller did. It wasn't an accident that he was an Indologist, right? And he's saying, this is the way, you know, to access religious truth. And then one of the other characteristics of that, I think, is this tendency, you know, implied, right, that we're comparing everything to Christianity, you know, and so that's ultimately the door we're always coming back to after we go off exploring. And I think I'm remembering correctly that that's actually how Max Muller convinced his colleagues at All Souls College, Oxford, to fund his research, right? As he said, if you let me study Sanskrit, I promise I will prove to you that Christianity is the culmination, like the pinnacle of all of these traditions. We can learn from them, but ultimately we're all going to be very happy with the results because it's going to show that this hierarchy still remains in place. So I'm sorry that was so long, but this is my background to the question. I just love, because on the one hand, I can see comparative theology as being really different from Max Muller's project, right? Because you're talking about the possibility for true transformation, for true learning in a way that I think seems really different from Max Muller's Science of Religion. But then on the other hand, I was really interested to hear you linking yourself to Muller. And I'd love to just hear you think about how do you think comparative theology can kind of guard, or should it be guarding, against some of these, since some parts of this lineage, and in what ways is it something totally different?
Yeah. No, a lot there in your comments. One thing, when I mentioned Max Muller in my opening, I wasn't saying that I was deeply indebted to Max Muller or that I was in his footsteps, but rather the term was used long before I was using it, and he occasionally uses the term comparative theology, not consistently, but he does use it at times. I mean, I read in part that both comparative religion and area studies are an effort to de-theologize the study of the cultures of the world. And that my department in Chicago, the South Asia department, I think was founded on the principle, and even people with theological dispositions like Hans van Buitenen, Edward Dimmock in a different way, people like that there in that department seem to be saying we only think of India in terms of religion. And we have to be able to step back and think in terms of language, literatures, ways of life, economics. I mean, drew in people, the Rudolphs from political science, and Kim Marriott from anthropology, and others, to try to get out of the category of religion and think more broadly about India, South Asia, South Asian studies, and therefore to break the category of theology. And then also people who either think comparison is a good idea, but you never can do it well. It's always impossible to do it well because you never know enough. I knew one lovely German scholar who always told me that he highly approved of comparative theology, except for the fact that he thought it could never actually be properly done because you would never know enough to do it well. You'd always fall short on one side or the other. But then, more common and deeper, the sense that if you're theological, either explicitly in comparative theology or implicitly in some of the comparative religion moves, you are using Christianity as the standard, and everything is measured against the standard of Christianity, either simply as the paradigm, or as you say with Muller, and I think McCulloch and Clark and others in the BU lineage, in order to show ultimately that the final and most complete of religions is Christianity. And I've just now compared them to all the others and see that this is the best of the all, even though the others have some good aspects to them. And I think in some ways it's a really valuable function to say that area studies tries to liberate the cultures and languages of the world from a heavy duty, all-encompassing kind of Christian theological move, and set traditions free and enable other parts of the world to be understood on different terms. Comparative religion also to try to escape from the clutches of theology as leading everything back to the Christian. But I think in some ways there's a loss also, because in some ways I find, well, in many ways, that the traditions we study, if we study them properly, they're deeply religious, they're matters of faith, they're matters of worship, they're matters of transformation of the world. The texts that we study want us to be transformed by them, and that the categories of Asian studies, South Asian studies, comparative religion may not be up to the task of actually taking these traditions adequately to heart. And therefore comparative theology has a role to play, and I'd never say everyone should do comparative theology, but to be able to say, granted that there's kind of an odious tradition of monopolizing and colonizing the other, nonetheless, if one excludes faith, excludes worship, doesn't believe that words lead you into the divine, something else is going to be missing. The issue of the reification, and again, coming up with the 10 great religions of the world and something like that. In some ways, we do this all the time because if we teach, we have to do something like that. And everybody I know, we use the word Hinduism, apologize for using the word Hinduism, saying there's really no such thing as Hinduism, and then we go back to using it again.
No, I hate that unit. I hate that unit in introductory courses. We just have to continuously deconstruct it.
Yeah, and I think part of it is to see our expectations, our starting points, our biases where they're leading us, and then critique them, and then realize we're not going to be, we don't even want to be 100% neutral observers of the world, but rather we have investments in it. And I think it's arguable that, you know, people can be truly open-minded and truly learn interreligiously, even if they have faith in their own tradition. And it doesn't have to be a liberal faith or a pluralistic faith, but you can, from a faith, as so many of the brilliant scholars of previous centuries were missionaries, who didn't do it despite their missionary instincts, but I think in partly fueled by that, somehow a sense of critiquing Christian monopolies and saying that as a Christian, but also not believing that at the end of the day, this will demolish all absolute religious claims, but that there's a back and forth, ultimate claims meeting one another and kind of encountering one another, I think is possible as well.
Mm.
So there's a lot going on in what you're asking, but go ahead, Megan.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to, if there's time, I'd love to follow up with a comment that I think that what you're saying about there being a loss certainly resonates with me, because I also am a historian, and sometimes I get frustrated in history as a discipline, the way that religion is talked about in almost an exclusively functionalist sense sometimes, right? You know, what is the, you know, why were they really doing this? You know, were they doing it for some political purpose, you know, being involved in this religious process, or were they trying to improve their class status? I'm using very, you know, random examples, but ultimately, I think that is limiting, right? If we're not taking seriously the fact that people can truly be transformed by ideas. And so this is something that really resonated with me. And I had another comment, but yeah, and what you said about area studies trying to de-theologize the study of South Asia, I think, you know, is definitely true as well. And sometimes it can go a little too far, to the point where in area studies now, sometimes it's just it can be very weird to bring up religion, right? Because it's this specter of, oh, are we going back there, you know, to this 19th century, you know, period. And so I think sometimes in area studies, we're struggling with how to bring it back in without, to take it seriously, as you're saying, without falling victim to those earlier traps.
Yeah.
We do have one more question that maybe we can get to as well.
Okay.
If you've got a comment there, Frank.
No, just to agree and to say that maybe it's, you know, the solution is in part what we're doing, whether we're doing it poorly or not, but to have area studies, comparative religion, theology, comparative theology, all sort of happening at the same time. Each one kind of mutually corrects the others. But I'd be, you know, obviously dead set against both kind of a re-Christianization of the academy such that it's all through a Christian lens, which is not going to happen. And on the other extreme, excluding theology from the AAR or something like that, which would really be a bad idea, because we'd no longer be able to study the religions we claim to be studying.
So Eric asked the question, is Christianity the pinnacle model of comparison to all other religious movements? How do we account for the colonial use of its historical and theological refinement? Is there a distinction between pre-Constantine and post-Christianity as we compare it to other theological movements?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question. I'm reading it now just to chat to make sure I have it clear. Well, obviously, I mean, the second part is easier. Is there a distinction between the pre-Constantine and post-Constantine Christianity as we compare it to other movements? It depends on which Christianity you're talking about in which time period, how kind of, you know, dominant it is, how kind of all-encompassing it claims to be, how imperial it can turn out to be. And there are many, many different versions of the Christian account tied in with colonialism in the modern world in various ways also that I think can be sorted out historically in terms of Christianity is not one size fits all, but it comes in different forms. But I think if one thinks about that, you know, even if one was to presume, I mean, one could presume Christianity is the pinnacle model of comparison for all other ones. I think once we assume that, unless one has a theological position in which the other is only vaguely represented, it doesn't actually hold up in the actual interreligious learning. You know, and I've talked about this 1,000 times over the years. that you claim, tell me what is unique about the Christian and unparalleled and supreme. Now read the Bhagavad Gita or read the Upanishad or read Buddhist Sutta or something like that. Where does your claim go when you actually know something about another religious tradition? It begins to break down. And perhaps you mentioned colonial use of its historical and theological refinement in positions of power where certain people get to set the terms of the discussion and decide who the winners are. But then it's only those people talking to themselves and not listening to the other. But if you bring the other in and say, you can say anything you want about the importance of the gospel and the power of encounter with Jesus Christ, but you should still read the Quran and see what happens when you engage the Quran, or read the Bhagavad Gita and see what happens. Because the powerful presence of the other in the life of somebody who's disposed to take scripture seriously breaks up a lot of those models, I think. So I'm very much in favor of, who's at my job, I'm not the Pope actually, to allow people to have their own faith and live their faith lives and be as intensely a believer as they wish to be. But I think slippage between your faith and universal claims about everybody else's faiths is a real problem. And it has to be, deep faith has to be, paralleled by deep humility, both as a person, but also as a scholar. Like, I'm continuing to learn and I don't really know enough. And it may be the case that Christianity is the supreme religion, but I've yet to see anyone in my lifetime actually show that that's the case. And this annoys people, like in conservative, Catholic circles, because they want me to conclude that Christianity is the best of all the religions, or they want to exclude me and say, well, since you won't say that, then you're not a theologian. But I'm saying it's not that easy, because you find yourself in complex situations where intellectually and even affectively you are complicated. And comparative theology, I think, helps mess up the boundaries by claiming to be academic, claiming to be theological, claiming to be comparative, claiming to be area studies. It has a claim on a whole range of disciplines that prevent one from making finalistic claims, I would say.
Any further questions or comments? I have one, but I want to let other people get in there too. Seeing none. Actually, I wonder, we've talked, at length about comparative theology without actually defining theology yet. And of course, in religious studies, we are constantly going around in circles talking about religion, and religious studies is still a very contested term and certainly a contested field. And I wonder how you define theology. You talked about it kind of faith-seeking understanding, but and that itself, can be unpacked. So I wonder if you can unpack that for us.
Yeah, I've gotten an awful lot of mileage out of calling it faith-seeking understanding for the last 35 years. And scholars once in a while, friendly scholars, friends will point out to me, well, you say loosely Augustine said that and Anselm said that, but actually it's more complicated if you actually read Augustine and read Anselm, what they meant by those terms, and fides quaerens intellectum and so on like that. Those are complicated ideas. But I think in terms of, let's say, to put it in terms of, I've been one of the proponents over the years that there's such a thing as Hindu theology, and that analogously, there is Islamic theology, and I realize it's kind of a subdivision of Islamic learning and so on like that. But sticking with Hindu theology for the moment, the idea that there's, there are different pramanas, there are different ways of knowing. There's perception, there's inference, and then there's word or shabda. And there's a sense of a revelation or a word that is given that is not reducible to what you can know with your five senses or infer from your five senses. Like knowing certain things about the world or about a god or about ritual practice come from only in the Vedanta, let's say, from reading the Upanishads and studying the text, or having a living guru who introduces you to certain higher forms of knowledge. That seems to me to be a mark of theology. So some kind of respect for revelation. Also some kind of overflow into practice. And I think it's not a very radical idea to say that you you claim to believe something, but how does it, do you meditate? Do you worship? Is there a kind of act of bodily psychological submission to the divine or something like that? There should be some kind of way in which what you practice leads to the transformation of the way you live your life, and that's theological. I also think theology is not private property, and that while this is true in all disciplines, so study of religion is not private property and area studies are not private property. We're always dealing with colleagues, but that one is receiving from tradition truths that have been passed down and which you are a holder of for a certain period of time, and then others take your place. A sense of lineage and a sense of tradition, along with a sense of worship, along with a sense of revelation. I guess you could, point also to doctrinal claims about belief in some kind of existence after death, some kind of a higher reality, which is not entirely the reality of this world. So I'm throwing out features of what would constitute a theological frame of looking at the world, all compacted really into that word of faith, but faith not having absolute answers, but faith opening up questions. But a key to it in the Hindu context would be if you believe that there's some kind of verbal revelation that gives you knowledge that you do not learn through reason or bodily experience, then you're getting into the realm of theology. And so it's always annoyed me over the years that people talk about Shankara, let's say the great Hindu thinker, as a philosopher, when all his work is commentary on scripture. He's commenting on the Upanishads and so on. And that doesn't seem to be what philosophers normally do, except if they're footnoting Plato or something like that. It's a matter of, receiving a revelation, teaching it, and then everyone claiming that somebody like Shankara, if you read his works properly, it dispels your ignorance, it shatters your illusions, and you become a liberated being. That would, be a characteristic in my mind of theology. In the academy, again, you can get into disputes, and I probably would not be the one to do this, but about the, the fights over what is the difference between theology and the study of religion. And some of my colleagues at Harvard say, well, theology is just one subdivision of the study of religion. It's a kind of study of religion. And I often think that study of religion is a kind of theology and push it the other way. But there are different boundaries. But I think that handy definition of faith-seeking understanding does get us pretty far. And one could say, if you have that, then you can say a Tibetan Buddhist could be a theologian because there's an inquiry and hardcore thinking related to some kind of faith disposition toward the world that goes beyond the five senses and so on. But comparative theology, just to finish, would say, if you're in a theological world, like a Catholic world, even BC and so on like that, where I taught, doing comparative work forces you to ask what is theology instead of taking it for granted. And that's a healthy thing also.
It's interesting to me that at least in Europe and certainly in the UK, programs in religious studies or universities, often the degrees are in theology and religious studies. And the distinction isn't very hard and fast. Certainly this is the case at Oxford, Cambridge, and most universities I know. And I think that's starting to move into North America as well. Particularly younger scholars who didn't fight the good fight of religious studies back in the 60s and 70s when administrators didn't want these departments to be there. I think younger scholars probably don't care too much about that distinction. I don't know if you're seeing that as well.
No, it's true. Yeah.
Well, listen, we have come to the end of this session. Thank you so much for really enlightening discussion and intriguing ideas about comparative theology. I'm wondering whether, you've convinced us all to switch over and be proper comparative theologians now. The power of the discourse might be that's attractive. So thank you again for all of that. I remind people that there is another talk tomorrow. I believe it's at 10 a.m. And it's with the Faith and Spirituality Center at the U of C. So you can find registration and contact details on the Clare website, and you're very welcome to come to that. It should be quite interesting, where Professor Clooney is going to be talking more about the teaching of all of these ideas. And so please do come along for that. It only remains then to thank Professor Clooney for, again, what a fantastic talk, and wish you all a good afternoon and good evening in Boston. And
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And I would just add that if anyone wants to follow up by email, I'd be happy to exchange emails with anyone who has further questions, because I love to follow up on things. So, but thank you all for coming and staying for so long. It's been great